The roar of 4 massive engines cuts through the frozen December air. Inside the cramped fuselage of a B-17 Flying Fortress, 10 young American airmen huddle at their stations, their breath visible in the sub-zero cold. The date is December 20th, 1943. The place is somewhere over Nazi Germany, where the sky itself has become a killing field. Through the bombardier's glass nose, the landscape below looks like a painter's canvas dotted with snow-covered forests and small villages. But there's nothing peaceful about this moment. This is the heart of the Third Reich, and these men are about to face hell. The aircraft shudders. A burst of flak explodes nearby, sending shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminum skin. Another explosion, then another. The sky is filled with black puffs of smoke, each one marking a point where a shell exploded, hoping to catch a bomber in its deadly radius. Inside the cockpit, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown grips the controls, his knuckles white. At just 21 years old, he's responsible for 9 other lives. The intercom crackles with voices from the crew, each man reporting his status, each voice trying to mask the fear they all feel. This is a story about that day, about what happened when a young American pilot met a German fighter ace in the skies above enemy territory, about a decision that would defy every rule of war, every order, every instinct that had been drilled into these men. What happened next wasn't supposed to be possible. In war, enemies don't show mercy. They don't spare each other. They certainly don't become friends. But sometimes, in the rarest of moments, humanity breaks through even the darkest hatred. And this is one of those moments. Charlie Brown never imagined he'd be flying combat missions over Germany. Just months earlier, he was a farm boy from West Virginia, dreaming of adventure, but never quite picturing it like this. The Army Air Forces had transformed him into a bomber pilot, giving him the controls of a B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the most powerful aircraft in the Allied arsenal. His crew was just as young, just as inexperienced. There was the navigator, barely 20, who plotted their course with trembling hands. The bombardier, tasked with dropping their payload on target, despite the chaos around them. 10 gunners positioned throughout the aircraft, scanning the skies for enemy fighters. The radio operator, the engineer, the waist gunners, all of them boys who'd become men far too quickly. They called their aircraft Ye Old Pub. The name was painted on the nose, a small piece of home carried into the war zone. This was only their first mission together as a crew. Though some had flown before, they were still learning to work as a unit, still building the trust that would be essential for survival. The mission brief had been clear. Strike the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. Destroy the facility where the Luftwaffe built its fighters. The target was strategic, important, and heavily defended. They knew the risks. Everyone who flew over Germany knew the risks. Of the bombers that flew into German airspace, the statistics were brutal. 1 in 4 would never return. Flak batteries lined every strategic target. German fighter squadrons scrambled at the first sight of Allied bombers. The cold at altitude could freeze a man's hands to metal. Oxygen could fail. Engines could quit. 1,000 things could go wrong at 25,000 feet, and when they did, there was nowhere to run. The first burst of flak came without warning. One moment the sky was clear. December 20th. The next, Charlie Brown clouds of shrapnel exploded around them, each one carrying thousands of metal fragments traveling at lethal speeds from their base in England. The bomber shook violently as a shell exploded nearby. Hundreds of other bombers. Another burst, a massive aerial armada heading east across the North Sea toward Germany. But the flak was everywhere. As they crossed creating a wall of fire they had to fly through. Every man was at his station. The gunners
Flak at 3
scanned the
o'clock.
sky. One of the gunners shouted over the intercom.
Flak at 9
Charlie
o'clock.
kept the bomber steady in
It was
formation,
coming from all directions.
watching the aircraft around
The German
him,
anti-aircraft
knowing that
batteries
staying
had years
together
of
was their
practice,
best defense,
and they were devastatingly
the target was
accurate.
ahead.
Charlie
The
watched
flak
as
was
a
about
bomber
to
off his
begin,
right wing took
and
a
their
direct
lives
hit.
were about to change
The
forever.
aircraft simply disintegrated, pieces of metal and men falling toward the earth below. They pressed forward. The target was ahead, and they had their orders. The bombardier called out the run, adjusting for wind and altitude. The bomb bay doors opened, and their payload dropped away. Mission accomplished. But now, they had to survive the flight home. That's when the fighters came. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the pride of the Luftwaffe, dove from above. Their machine guns and cannons opened fire, tracer rounds slicing through the formation. The American gunners returned fire, filling the sky with bullets. But the German pilots were experienced, aggressive, and deadly. Yeah, Old Pub's guns hammered away. Empty shell casings rattled around the gunners' feet. The smell of cordite filled the aircraft. Charlie threw the bomber into evasive maneuvers, trying to shake the fighters, but they kept coming. Then came the hit that changed everything. A 20-millimeter cannon shell punched through the nose of the aircraft, exploding in the bombardier's compartment. The plexiglass shattered. Freezing air rushed in at 200 miles per hour. The bombardier was hit, bleeding, screaming. The navigator tried to help him while also trying to keep them on course. More hits. The tail gunner's position took fire. The intercom went silent from that station. No response. Another burst tore through the waist, wounding 2 more gunners. The hydraulic lines ruptured, spraying fluid throughout the compartment. Engine number 2 erupted in flames. Charlie hit the fire suppression, but the engine was gone. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. They dropped out of formation, losing altitude, becoming a straggler, the most vulnerable position in the sky. The oxygen system failed. At this altitude, a man has about 15 seconds of useful consciousness without oxygen. Charlie's vision began to tunnel. His hands felt heavy on the controls. The world started to fade. He was dying, and he knew it. But he couldn't do anything about it. The bomber went into a dive, falling toward the earth. The G-forces pressed the crew into their stations. They were going down, and there was nothing anyone could do. Somehow, at a lower altitude where the air was thicker, Charlie regained consciousness. He pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. The airframe groaned in protest. Metal stressed to its limits. But slowly, impossibly, the bomber leveled out. They were at just 500 feet above the German countryside, flying so low they could see people on the ground looking up at them. 3 of the 4 engines were damaged or destroyed. Half the crew was wounded. The tail was barely hanging on. The nose was gone, exposing the crew to the brutal cold and wind. But they were alive. Barely flying, but alive. Charlie pointed the crippled bomber west, toward England, toward home. They had hundreds of miles to go over enemy territory in an aircraft that shouldn't be able to fly at all. That's when the lone German fighter appeared. Franz Stigler was not supposed to be in the air that day. The 27-year-old Luftwaffe pilot had already flown 2 combat missions and was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 at a forward airfield near Oldenburg when the call came. American bombers were in the area. A damaged straggler had been spotted. Franz was an ace, a skilled pilot with 27 confirmed kills. One more victory would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. For a fighter pilot, this was the ultimate achievement, the recognition that you were among the elite. His ground crew worked frantically to rearm and refuel his aircraft. Minutes later, Franz was back in the cockpit, engine roaring to life, racing down the runway and climbing into the winter sky. He spotted the crippled B-17 almost immediately. It was flying impossibly low, trailing smoke, clearly struggling to stay airborne. This would be an easy kill. He armed his guns, lined up for the attack run, and closed in for the kill. But as he drew nearer, Franz saw something that made him hesitate. The tail gun wasn't moving. He flew closer, studying the bomber. The tail gunner's position was destroyed. The glass shattered, the guns pointing uselessly at odd angles. He could see inside the aircraft now. He saw the waist gunners trying to tend to wounded crewmen. He saw blood on the fuselage walls. He saw the gaping holes torn through the thin metal skin. This wasn't a combat-ready bomber. This was a flying wreck, barely holding together, filled with wounded and dying men. Franz pulled alongside just meters away from the wingtip. He could see the pilots in the cockpit now, exhausted, desperate, fighting to keep their aircraft flying. The pilot turned and looked at him, and their eyes met across the empty air. In that moment, Franz Stigler faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Franz had been a fighter pilot since before the war began. He'd flown in North Africa, in Italy, over the Mediterranean. He'd faced British Spitfires and American P-47s. He'd shot down enemy aircraft and watched his friends die in flames. But he'd also been taught something that most people wouldn't associate with the Luftwaffe. His commanding officer in North Africa, a veteran named Gustav Rodel, had instilled in his pilots a code of honor that went beyond following orders. Franz remembered Rodel's words as if they'd been spoken yesterday. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. You fight with honor, or you don't fight at all." Looking at the shattered B-17, Franz saw men in parachutes. They just hadn't jumped yet. They were helpless, unable to defend themselves, trying desperately to survive. Shooting them down would be murder, not combat. But there was more to it than that. Franz had been a Lufthansa airline pilot before the war. He'd flown passengers across Europe, responsible for their safety, trained to protect lives. Looking at that bomber, some part of him saw passengers, not enemies. He saw human beings who wanted nothing more than to get home. He thought about the Knight's Cross. One more kill, and it would be his. His name would be celebrated. He'd be decorated, honored, remembered. All he had to do was press the trigger. Instead, he waggled his wings to get the American pilot's attention. Charlie Brown, exhausted and confused, watched the German fighter flying alongside him. Was this it? Was this how they would die? Franz pointed toward England, toward the coast. He gestured. "Get out of here. Go home." Charlie couldn't believe what he was seeing. A German fighter, close enough to shoot them down with ease, was telling them to escape. It made no sense. Nothing about this made sense. But Franz wasn't done. He knew that if he left them, other fighters or flak batteries would finish the job. So he made a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed and executed. He decided to escort them out of German airspace. For the next several minutes, Franz Stigler flew formation with Ye Olde Pub. He stayed on their wing, visible to any German forces that might see them, making it clear that this bomber was under his protection. Other Luftwaffe pilots saw them and prepared to attack, but when they recognized Franz's aircraft, they held their fire, confused by what they were seeing. Flak batteries spotted the bomber, but didn't shoot, uncertain why a German fighter was escorting an American bomber. Charlie Brown kept the bomber flying west, every second bringing them closer to safety, but also closer to running out of fuel, to having an engine fail completely, to the aircraft simply falling apart from the damage it had sustained. Franz stayed with them over German-occupied Holland. He could see the coastline ahead, the North Sea beyond it. Once they crossed that line, they'd be over Allied territory. They might actually make it home. As they approached the coast, Franz pulled closer one last time. He looked across at Charlie, made eye contact, and saluted. It was a gesture of respect, pilot to pilot, one warrior acknowledging another. Then he peeled away, banking hard and disappearing back toward Germany before British coastal defenses could engage him. Charlie Brown watched the German fighter vanish, still not quite believing what had just happened. His wounded crew was alive, his shattered bomber was still flying, and a German ace had just saved their lives. The flight back to England was a nightmare of its own. Ye Old Pub limped across the North Sea, losing altitude, engines sputtering, the crew treating their wounded as best they could with limited medical supplies. They were heading for their home base, but Charlie quickly realized they'd never make it that far. The bomber was dying. They needed to land, and soon, or they'd end up in the freezing waters of the North Sea. An emergency airfield came into view. Charlie called in on the radio, declaring an emergency, requesting immediate clearance to land. The control tower cleared them, and emergency crews scrambled to prepare for their arrival. The landing gear wouldn't extend. The hydraulics were shot. Charlie had to lower the gear manually, cranking it down by hand while flying the aircraft with the other hand. The crew worked together, everyone helping despite their injuries, knowing that this landing could still kill them all. Charlie lined up on final approach. The runway stretched ahead, looking impossibly narrow. The bomber was barely controllable, shaking and rattling, pieces threatening to fall off with every moment. The wheels touched down. The aircraft bounced, settled, and rolled down the runway. Charlie stood on the brakes. They squealed in protest, but they held. The bomber slowed, finally coming to a stop at the end of the runway. They'd made it, against impossible odds, with half the crew wounded and the aircraft shot to pieces. They'd made it home. Emergency crews rushed to the aircraft. Medics climbed aboard to treat the wounded. Ground crew inspected the damage and couldn't believe the bomber had flown at all. They counted over 400 holes in the fuselage. 3 engines were destroyed. The tail should have fallen off. By every measure, this aircraft should have crashed over Germany. But it hadn't. Because a German pilot had chosen mercy over glory. Charlie Brown and his surviving crew were debriefed by intelligence officers. They told the story of the German fighter that had escorted them to safety. They described Franz's salute, his protection, his impossible act of compassion in the middle of a brutal war. The intelligence officers listened, took notes, and then gave Charlie an order. Never speak of this again. The story was to be classified. The war had no room for stories of German humanity. The public needed to see the enemy as monsters, not as men capable of mercy. Charlie obeyed. He didn't talk about it with his crew. He didn't write home about it. He locked the memory away, though it haunted him for decades. Who was that German pilot? Why did he spare them? Would he survive the war? Franz Stigler returned to his base and said nothing about what he'd done. He knew that if his commanding officers learned he'd spared an enemy bomber, he could face a firing squad. Allowing enemy aircraft to escape was treason. He'd violated his orders, ignored his duty, and thrown away a chance at the Knight's Cross. But he slept well that night, knowing he'd saved 10 lives. The Knight's Cross would have been nice,
But he'd won something far more valuable: his humanity. Both men continued to serve. Charlie Brown flew more missions, always carrying the memory of that December day. He survived the war, returned to America, and tried to build a normal life. But combat doesn't leave you easily. The faces of his wounded crew, the sound of shells tearing through metal, the sight of that German fighter flying alongside, these memories never faded. Franz Stigler kept flying combat missions. He shot down more Allied aircraft. He was eventually transferred to the Me-262 jet fighter program, becoming one of the first jet fighter pilots in history. He survived the war as well, despite the odds that killed most fighter pilots on both sides. After Germany's surrender, Franz immigrated to Canada. He settled in British Columbia, far from the battlefields of Europe, and tried to forget the war. He worked as a businessman, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his time in the Luftwaffe. Both men carried the weight of that day in December 1943. Both wondered what had become of the other. But the world was vast, and finding one pilot among millions of veterans seemed impossible. Decades passed. The 1950s became the 1960s. The Cold War raged. A new generation grew up knowing World War II only from history books. The veterans grew older, their memories becoming history. But Charlie Brown never forgot. He couldn't forget. Somewhere out there was the German pilot who had saved his life, and Charlie wanted to know who he was. In 1986, more than 4 decades after that December day, Charlie Brown decided to try to find the German pilot. He had retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel, but the mystery had never left him. He needed to know who had shown him such extraordinary mercy. He started by contacting military historians, aviation researchers, and veterans organizations. He described the encounter, gave the date and location, and asked if anyone knew of a German pilot who might have done such a thing. He placed ads in veterans' newsletters and magazines. He attended air shows and aviation conferences, telling his story to anyone who would listen. Most people were skeptical. Spare an enemy bomber? Escort it to safety? It seemed too incredible to be true. But Charlie was persistent. He'd seen it happen. He'd lived it. And he was determined to find the man who'd saved him. 4 years passed with no success. Charlie began to lose hope. Maybe the pilot had died in the war. Maybe he didn't want to be found. Maybe Charlie would never know his name. Then, in 1990, Franz Stigler saw one of Charlie's ads in a newsletter. Franz was living in Vancouver when he came across the newsletter. He almost didn't read it. Just another veterans publication filled with old war stories. But something caught his eye. A story about a B-17 bomber damaged over Germany, escorted to safety by a German fighter pilot. The date matched. The location matched. The details were exact. Franz's hands trembled as he read. For 47 years, he'd kept that mission a secret, never telling anyone what he'd done. He'd assumed the American crew had died in the war or had forgotten about him. But here was proof that they'd survived, that they remembered, that one of them was searching for him. He sat down and wrote a letter to Charlie Brown. He described the mission from his perspective, taking off from Oldenburg, spotting the crippled bomber, making the decision to spare it. He included details that only someone who'd been there could know: the number of engines damaged, the hole in the nose, the altitude where they'd flown. He sealed the letter and mailed it, not knowing if Charlie would believe him, not knowing what kind of response he'd receive. When Charlie received the letter, he was stunned. He read it over and over, checking every detail against his own memories. Everything matched perfectly. This was him. This was the pilot who'd saved Ye Old Pub. Charlie immediately called the phone number Franz had included. When Franz answered, neither man could speak at first. 47 years of silence, of wondering, of carrying this shared memory alone. And now, finally, they were talking. They spoke for hours that first time, comparing stories, filling in gaps, reliving that December day from both perspectives. Charlie learned that Franz was a fellow pilot who'd flown with Lufthansa before the war. Franz learned that all but one of the crew had survived, living long lives because of his decision. They made plans to meet in person. After nearly 5 decades, the German fighter pilot and the American bomber pilot were going to meet face to face. In 1990, Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown met at a hotel in Seattle. Both were now in their 70s, grandfathers, men who'd lived full lives far removed from the war. But as they approached each other in that hotel lobby, they were 27 and 21 again, 2 pilots meeting in the sky. They embraced like brothers. There were tears, laughter, and an immediate bond that surprised everyone who witnessed it. These were former enemies, men who should have killed each other, now hugging and crying tears of joy. They spent days together, talking about the war, about their lives since, about that moment in 1943 that had connected them forever. Charlie introduced Franz to the surviving members of his crew. Men who'd been wounded that day shook hands with the German pilot who'd saved them. Franz met Charlie's wife and children, his grandchildren, an entire family that existed because Franz had chosen not to pull the trigger. The weight of that realization was overwhelming. If he'd made the conventional choice, the military choice, none of these people would exist. The reunion made news. Journalists covered the story. Television crews interviewed both pilots. The world learned about an act of mercy that had been hidden for decades, a story that challenged the simple narrative of World War II as a conflict of pure good versus absolute evil. Franz and Charlie became close friends. They attended air shows together, giving joint presentations about their encounter. They visited museums and spoke to school groups, sharing their story as a lesson about the humanity that can exist even in war's darkest moments. Franz told Charlie something he'd never told anyone else. I didn't think about the Knight's Cross. I didn't think about orders or duty. I just couldn't shoot at a man who was already down. Charlie responded, "You were the most honorable enemy I ever faced." Brothers in arms. For the next 18 years, until Franz's death in 2008, the 2 men remained close friends. They spoke regularly on the phone, visited each other's homes, and continued to share their story with the world. In 1995, Franz returned to Germany for the first time since the war. Charlie went with him. Together, they visited the airfield where Franz had taken off on that December day. They stood on the runway where his Messerschmitt had rolled to takeoff, where he'd made the decision that would define both their lives. They traveled to Bremen, as close as they could get to where the encounter had happened. The factories were gone now, rebuilt or replaced by modern buildings. But the sky was the same, the vast European sky where 2 enemies had met and become forever linked. Charlie's wife took photographs of them standing together, 2 old pilots with their arms around each other, smiling in the winter sunshine. They were standing where they'd once tried to kill each other, and now they couldn't imagine life without their friendship. In 2008, Franz Stigler passed away at age 92. Charlie Brown spoke at his funeral, telling the story one more time, explaining how this man had saved his life and the lives of his crew. Charlie called Franz "my brother," and no one in attendance questioned the word. Charlie lived another 5 years, passing away in 2013 at age 87. In his final years, he often spoke about Franz
about their friendship, about the lesson their story taught. War, he would say, brings out the worst in humanity. But sometimes, in the rarest moments, it brings out the absolute best. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown has been told in books, documentaries, and countless articles. Their encounter has been studied in military academies as an example of ethics in combat. It's been discussed in philosophy classes as a case study in moral courage. But beyond the academic interest, the story resonates because it challenges our assumptions. We want war to be simple, us versus them, good versus evil, heroes versus villains. The story of these two pilots reminds us that war is fought by human beings, and human beings are complex, capable of both terrible violence and extraordinary compassion. Franz Stigler could have been celebrated as a hero in Nazi Germany. He could have won his Knight's Cross, been promoted, been given a place in the propaganda machine. Instead, he chose obscurity and conscience. He gave up glory to preserve his humanity. Charlie Brown could have ordered his gunners to fire at the German fighter. Franz was in range, vulnerable, focused on the bomber. They could have taken him down. But in that moment of shared humanity, combat became impossible. You can't shoot someone who's showing you mercy. The photograph of them together, two elderly men, arms around each other smiling, is one of the most powerful images to come out of World War II. It shows what happens when we choose to see the humanity in our enemies, when we put conscience above orders, when we remember that the person in the other uniform is someone's son, someone's father, someone's friend. Their story has inspired countless people to reconsider their own prejudices and hatreds. If a German fighter pilot and an American bomber crew could find common ground, could become friends, could look past their uniforms and orders and national loyalties, then maybe anyone can. December 20th, 1943. The sky above Germany. Two aircraft, enemies in a brutal war, fly side by side in an impossible moment of peace. What made Franz Stigler show mercy that day? He spent the rest of his life trying to answer that question. He spoke about his training, about Gustav Rodel's code of honor, about his pre-war life as a civilian pilot. But ultimately, he would say, it came down to a simple recognition. Those weren't enemies in that bomber. They were men. They were trying to survive, and they needed help. What made Charlie Brown accept that mercy? He could have been suspicious, could have believed it was a trick, could have ordered his gunners to fire. But in that moment, exhausted and desperate, he recognized compassion when he saw it. He recognized that Franz was offering him a gift, the gift of life. Their story teaches us that rules, orders, and loyalties have limits. At some point, we have to listen to our own conscience, make our own moral choices, and accept the consequences. Franz risked execution by sparing that bomber. Charlie risked his mission by trusting a German fighter. Both men chose humanity over duty, and both were rewarded with a lifelong friendship. The true measure of a person, Franz would later say, is what they do when no one is watching. When he was alone in that cockpit, when he had the power of life and death, when no one would have questioned his decision to shoot down an enemy bomber. In that moment, he chose mercy. And that choice echoed through the decades that followed. Today, the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is taught in schools, discussed in history classes, and remembered by aviation enthusiasts around the world. Their encounter has been dramatized, analyzed, and celebrated as one of the most remarkable moments of World War II. But perhaps the most important audience for their story
isn't historians or students or military professionals. It's ordinary people who face their own choices about how to treat others, especially those they're supposed to see as enemies. In our world of tribal politics, international conflicts, and deep divisions, the lesson of Franz and Charlie is more relevant than ever. It's easy to dehumanize people we disagree with, to see them as obstacles or enemies rather than as fellow human beings. It's harder, much harder, to recognize our shared humanity, especially when we're supposed to be in conflict. Franz Stigler saw past the uniform to the men inside. Charlie Brown saw past the threat to the compassion being offered. Both men were transformed by their encounter, and through their story, perhaps we can be transformed as well. The sky above Germany on December 20th, 1943, witnessed something rare and beautiful, a moment when mercy overcame hatred, when conscience overcame duty, when two enemies became brothers. That moment reminds us that even in war's darkest hours, humanity can break through. And that's a lesson worth remembering in war and in peace, now and forever.